Okay, so we now come to the final session then of our weekend course on Science, Faith and Society, and we just want to welcome back to the podium, as it were, Professor David Cook, who's going to speak to us in this final session. David is the Holmes Professor of Faith and Learning at Wheaton College in the United States. He's also a Fellow at Green College in Oxford, and is also Professor of Christian Ethics at Southern Seminary in Louisville. But I think still remains best known probably in this country for his many years broadcasting as part of the Moral Maze team. And so it's very appropriate that David's going to speak to us today on bioethics in the media and public policy. Thank you, David.
I'm much more at home in this particular topic than in the previous topic I was given to speak on. Bioethics in the media and public policy. One little footnote that you should recognize, I began teaching bioethics, in those days of course it was called medical ethics, back in the early 70s. Now the advantage of starting in the early 70s was that nobody else taught medical ethics. And so you became an expert. You became an expert not because you knew anything, but because you were the only one who was doing it. And I spent 4 or 5 years teaching in the medical school in Nottingham before I moved to Oxford, and then began to do in the medical school in Oxford what I've been doing in the medical school in Nottingham, and it just grew and grew and grew. So much so that there came the point where they used to describe me in the BBC as the bioethicist, that medical, as if there was only one. Now, of course, everybody else has caught up, but because I was first, I still have a slight claim to difference. Why does bioethics matter? Why does it matter? It matters, of course, because it affects issues of life and death. It's interesting how Pete, in his presentations, were drawing attention to the hard cases, and how we're fascinated by the hard cases. In the world of broadcasting and in the world of writing, always you're looking for attention getters. You're looking for things that will really make people drool. And ideally, if somebody weeps. I've made many programs, and sometimes just looking at me is enough. They start weeping. I say to the producer, I'm really sorry. Oh, no, more. They love when they weep. And I took part, I'm ashamed to say, in Kilroy, which is a chat show which has now died to death. But Kilroy loved to make people cry, and he used to shove the microphone in people's faces and get down beside them, just pray for them to weep, because he knew it made very good television. People are affected by matters of life and death, and our own vulnerability and our own sensibility is aroused. That's partly why bioethics matters. It matters because it affects people. It affects people, and some of the issues, particularly when people are ill, when people are unwell, when people are very clearly affected by the medical sciences, people are affected. And not just, of course, the patient, him or herself, not just the child, but also the whole family. And we feel a natural sympathy with people in suffering type situations. It affects people, and it affects them very deeply. That means that people are very vulnerable. And I think sometimes we forget that. Doctors and nurses, to cope with the pressure, often become quite hardened. Some of the humour in hospitals is not always of the most edifying nature, but it's a veneer that you have to cope with some of the awful things that you see and some of the awful things that happen. But very quickly you see how vulnerable people are. I remember being in a room where they had to tell an elderly lady that her husband, who'd come in with a heart attack, had died, and how she just sank to her knees and began to weep in the doctor's, between his legs, holding on to him for dear life. And it was so moving, because here was a woman who was totally vulnerable. It's also very complicated. Living in a little ivory tower is a wonderful thing, apart from 2 curses. One is the email and the other is the telephone. And in Oxford, my little ivory tower there, every now gets disturbed when the telephone rings. Now, when we started medical ethics in Oxford, they phoned me up about everything, because medical ethics was brand new, so they wanted to check everything. Now my aim in teaching medical ethics was so that people would be able to do it themselves. It was really to do me out of a job. I haven't quite succeeded, because what they do now is they keep the really nasty, tricky cases for you. And so you know when the telephone rings and they say, it's the hospital, or it's the genetics department, it's ITU, whatever it is, that this is a really nasty one. They've tried to solve it themselves, hasn't worked. They've asked the chaplaincy, hasn't worked. They've taken soundings in the hospital, it hasn't worked. Oh well, we better try Cook then. And so you know it's really bad news. And some of these cases are very, very complicated. It needs some kind of regulation. I want to return to that in a few moments as we think about why bioethics needs to be regulated, why medical sciences need some kind of regulation. We're also talking about public policy. Why does public policy get involved? Well, I think there's a great deal to the notion of funding and money. Most of my colleagues in Green College spend a great deal of their time, far too much of their time, in trying to raise funds, trying to find sources of hard money rather than soft money. And of course the government funding agencies, the MRC, SRC, they are now much less generous than they were in years past. So what's happened is that drug companies particularly become involved. One of my roles is in the Central Oxford Research Ethics Committee. And we have to foresee, all except psychiatric, all cases, all clinical trials involving patients have to go through Central Oxford Research Ethics Committee. So on average a month will be about 120 cases to examine. So it's a big deal. Now it's interesting, some of the applications all look exactly the same. And you think this is slightly odd. How can 3 or 4 different research teams produce exactly the same form? And then you look at who is funding this work. And you discover this was not written by the researchers, this was written by the drug company. And the drug company has a particular formula, template, and that's the way it goes. So we invite the researchers to come and talk about their project. Now, this is a very bad moment for the researchers, because it's quite clear after 2 or 3 sentences that they know nothing about this particular piece of research, but it's part of a much wider deal that the drug company has done with either the hospital or the unit, and so they are supposed to hold the line. Now, in order to try to cope with this, we have at the end now a little statement, and I submitted this in my own writing, to make sure that you actually take responsibility for it. Because we discovered that one researcher who signed off was in fact responsible for almost 3/4 of all the research happening in one hospital. There were 17 different areas he was involved in, but he was still the main lead researcher, and this was less than ideal. Drug companies are funding research, but so also are foundations. Now, the trouble with drug companies and the trouble with foundations is they have an agenda. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but transparency in the sense of knowing what the agenda, knowing what the spin, knowing what the desire is very, very important. Which is why, as Derek was showing, you have to declare your interests. And any time in the Central Oxford Research Ethics Committee, we have to declare an interest at any and every meeting. And we would debar ourselves from actually taking part in a discussion if you even knew the researcher well, just to make sure that it's genuinely above suspicion. But it's not always above suspicion as far as the public are concerned. We heard again from talking about GM foods, the public concern and public anxiety. And I was involved in Oxford when the spin-off of Alderhay happened. And the way in which that paralysed hospitals around the country was really quite frightening. Because every hospital was required to find any traces of any slides which had been taken without permission. Now you have to understand the thinking of many doctors. I'm not talking now about the medical staff in Alderhay, but in other units around the country. Here's a family, they've lost a loved one, they're very, very upset, and they want to understand what's happened, why it's happened, and the doctors are not sure. And so the doctors think, well, I'll just take a little slide, I'll just take a little piece of tissue, and then we'll be able to find out what happened, what really happened for this child. And I don't want to upset the parents further, so we won't go through all the rigmarole of asking for permission, and they just took the slide. Now, of course, some of these slides were taken many, many years previously, and so they were all over every hospital. And the government required every hospital to go through all possible sources, and that took weeks and weeks and weeks. But you were not given a license to continue with some of your pathology work until you'd done it. And so the unit, the pathology unit, came to a halt until this work was done, because public concern, public anxiety was so great. Of course, public anxiety often translates in very personal ways. We had a fascinating letter from a gentleman about his wife. Actually, he wasn't really interested in his wife, who was now deceased. He was interested in his wife's leg, which had been amputated in the hospital in Oxford. And when he read what happened at Alderley, he thought his wife's leg might still be available somewhere in Oxford. And please, could we find his wife's leg so he could have the leg stuffed, and he would have a constant reminder of his wife. And this, I have to say, was said with all seriousness and a good deal of passion, that we somehow couldn't find the leg. It's amazing. We did look. Public policy gets involved because pressure groups can drive funding and funding sources. Often we like to think that research is pure. Pure in the sense it's not really tainted with money, pure in the sense that people will do it from the best kinds of motives, and often that is true. But sometimes the direction of the research can be unsuccessful. I'll give you an example from the hospital world about the way that the person in charge can drive a unit. The intensive therapy unit has teams, and one person is in charge. And this day it was a doctor, a male, probably in his mid-late 50s, round, balding, a golfer. And a patient came in who'd had a heart attack. He was in his mid-late 50s, round, bald, played golf, and he came in. And they began to work on this particular patient. And after an hour, the team said to the doctor, "Nothing's happening, we should stop." "No, we're going to carry on." And so they carried on, at which point somebody in intensive therapy had a heart attack. Now, you can only work on one patient at a time. And so they said, "We should work on this patient who's in ITU." And he said, "No, we're working on this man." And so they kept on working on this man, and the other patient died. So now they've been working almost 2 hours on this patient, and it wasn't going anywhere, and the nursing staff were beginning to plead that they stop. Somebody else is brought in with a heart attack. He says, "No, we only work on one at a time. This one is the most important." Now, why was this patient so important? The fact that he was same age, same appearance, same kinds of hobbies, seemed to have some kind of influence. And I think crudely, this particular doctor was really trying to save himself. That was how he interpreted it. He brought a very particular agenda. Now, the nurses were very unhappy with that. But when I suggested to them, if their mother had been brought in, would they have behaved differently from the doctor? "Oh, no, 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 that would be different." So it's not just that doctors can be subjective, everybody can be subjective. But we have to have some system whereby we check. If you look at the research in HIV and AIDS, many HIV and AIDS researchers tell me that the power and the financial pressure from often the gay groups has led to a number of false directions in HIV and AIDS work. And many researchers feel that if they'd been given a freer hand to pursue research, then they might have taken a different kind of agenda. So who sets the agenda when it comes to public policy and to pressure groups, the way that they influence? We've had a number of references to Greenpeace and the way that that is driven. George Monbiot was telling me that when GM foods first came out, they had a meeting of all the pressure groups, and they wanted to stop GM foods. But how could they do that? So they spent an evening trying to find some kind of way of bringing this to halt. And then somebody came up with Frankenfoods. And they said, we've got it. We've got the slogan. Anything to do with Frankenstein, mad scientists, the public will automatically assume Frankenfoods, and that was the headline in the newspapers the next day. And so PR, pressure groups can drive public reaction, can drive, indeed, public policy. When we began research ethics committees, we had a very simple rule. Would the professional do it to himself or herself? We then discovered that some professionals will do anything to themselves for the sake of their theory. So we said, all right, then we'll have a different standard. Would they do it to members of their family? And then we discovered that some professionals will do anything to their family for the sake of the theory. And that's how we started, really, to have research ethics committees. Because we were not convinced that if you left it to the individual and you left it to their own devices, that you would come up with standards. And so much so that these kinds of standards now are literally standardized. And that's why the law sets limits. The Human Fertilization Embryology Authority, the Gene Therapy Advisory Committee, United Kingdom Xenotransplantation Interim Regulatory Authority, all of them are setting limits. All of them are enshrined in some kind of law. All of them are enforceable. All of them control all the activity, whether it's all the fertility work or all the genetic work or all the xenotransplantation work, the law. Now what's interesting to my mind is that one of the complaints that people have about ethics is, well, a disaster happens and then you are called to set up some kind of ethical limits. With xenotransplantation, the government tried to be proactive rather than reactive. Nobody was actually doing xenotransplantation, but they knew it was a possibility. They knew that the science was in place, and they said, now before science presents us with people having a pig's heart or a donkey's heart or whatever, let's actually put in place a structure. And if you go on the UK ZERA website, you'll find there is a very complex structure about the kinds of research, about the limits on research, about how patients are to be monitored, how they're to be followed up, how they're to be safeguarded, all proactively. We have still not had a xenotransplant. We haven't had a full organ xenotransplant. We have had various skin grafts, which are variations on xenotransplant, but not the full deal. But here is the law setting limits, and here it's doing it prospectively rather than retrospectively. And I think that's interesting that public policy can be proactive. And I think that's worth exploring in the realm of science. For too often, professional groups have called people like myself in and said, here are the ethical issues, please advise us. And now I've taken to saying to them, tell me what you are doing today. What are the ethical questions you are confronted with? Then tell me what you're going to do next year. And then tell me what you're likely to do in 5 years' time. And let's begin to think prospectively about the kinds of standards, the kinds of values that we can have. Because if these are the cutting-edge researchers, they know the likely fruits in the short term and in the longer term. And we can be prospective rather than simply retrospective, trying to close the door after the horse has actually bolted. Now, part of the problem for public policy is how do we balance public opinion and political preferences. And an issue like abortion, an issue like euthanasia is very dependent on public opinion and political preferences. We've had a good deal of beating the bush this last weekend. And clearly, President Bush and his supporters are trying to balance their particular view of public opinion and matching, in as much as it does, their political preferences and holding those together. But that's true on the right as it's true on the left. It's not an option just for one or the other. It's a proper kind of question. How do you balance public opinion? And of course we need to think who influences public opinion and how is public opinion influenced. And slogans, as we look in the media, we'll see that sloganizing is very important. How does the media get involved? I want to spend a few minutes trying to talk about the media and how it works so that you have a very clear idea. In coming to this conference and in meeting with you folks, I become more aware of the need to help science and to help scientists communicate better. It's not that they don't communicate, they do communicate to each other very, very well, but they don't always communicate in the marketplace, and that may be for all kinds of reasons. But I am confident that we can actually help scientists communicate better in a way which will actually change and affect public opinion. Now, in order to do that, we have to understand the medium. And of course, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I'm sure all of you will remember the picture of a naked little girl running down a lane in Vietnam covered in napalm. You remember a picture of a young man with a flower, inserting the flower in the barrel of a tank in Tiananmen Square. The picture is worth 1,000 words. And pictures carry values. They're not neutral. They give particular kinds of values. If I were technically minded, like many of my esteemed colleagues, I would show you a picture of a man grabbing at a little girl and ask you, what is that? And most likely you would tell me, this is a child abuser kidnapping a child. And then I would show you the whole of the picture, which has a 10-ton truck about to hit the child, and this man is grabbing the child to save the life of the child. And now you say, oh, isn't that wonderful? Now, the picture carries value, and we interpret. And so what kind of pictures are we giving? What kind of pictures are we sending out? I made a program about a lady who was a professional scientist, a biologist, had a highly successful academic career, and one day she was reading that well-known medical journal, Hello magazine, and in the Hello magazine she read about a lady of 62 who had had twins in Italy. And this lady thought, this is for me. Now, she was not married, she'd never had sexual relations, she was past the menopause, but a 62-year-old had fulfilled those criteria, so she thought, this is for me. Now, we met the lady and we made a program about this lady. But what was interesting was the newspaper articles about this woman. The newspaper articles all had a picture. And if the newspaper was in favor of the woman looked like $1 million in the photographs. She was dressed up, she was made up, her hair was specially done. If the newspaper did not like the woman, she looked scruffy. She looked as if she didn't wash properly, she looked as if she didn't know how to dress, she looked like a ramshackle. And the picture carried, even before you read the story, even before you read the headline, already you were being given a very distinct impression. A picture is worth 1,000 words and it carries values. I told you about this program Mailbag that I took part in. I was phoned up by Radio 1. Now, I have to say this is not my normal media kind of contact. And Radio 1 said, we'd like you to come on a program. And I said, Radio 4, that's what I do. They said, no, this is Radio 1. It's an hour-long live program. I said, there is no way I'm going on Radio 1 live for an hour. They said, well, it's with the female disc jockey, Annie Nightingale. Yes! You don't give people a chance to change their mind. So I went down to London and I met Annie Nightingale. And she said, hello, David. And I said, hello, Annie. She said, come in the studio and relax. So went in the studio relaxing with Annie Nightingale. And she said, now the program's very simple. It lasts an hour. I'll introduce you. I'll play a few records. And then we've made a tape compilation. On this tape, there are 7 moments. And during the program, I'm going to play one of the moments, and then I'll ask you a question, we'll have a little discussion, then a few more records, and we'll play a second piece of tape. Is that all right? And I said, yes, Annie, because we're close personal friends by now. Yes, Annie, I said, but the only thing is, what's on the tape. She said, oh David, it would spoil the spontaneity of the program if we told you in advance. So we went in the studio, she introduced me, this is live, and there's 7 million listeners for this, and she plays the few records, and then the first piece of tape. First piece of tape was the Hindenburg disaster. Here is the balloon, the dirigible taking off. Here is the commentator describing it, and suddenly the plane explodes. The balloon bursts, it's engulfed in flames. The commentator is physically weeping as he's describing. Annie Nightingale switches off. Live Radio 1, 7 million people. Now David, would you like to tell us why God let that happen? Now this was a bad moment, because Annie Nightingale was looking for a very simplistic solution to a very complicated problem. And of course that's the way that the media work. They do not want complexity, they don't even want careful balance. What they want is a bottom line which is definite one way or the other. They want the answer. And again, they'll say, tell me what the answer is. And if they don't like the answer, they'll ask the question in a different way, and they'll ask the question again and again and again. And I've been in settings where they've asked me the same question 20 times and 20 times. I've given the same answer, and they say, is there no other way that you can express it? You know, because they want a very particular response. Is it simple? Well, I'm always a great believer in it being simple, but often it's simplistic. And I should tell you what I said to Annie Nightingale. I said it reminded me of the Irishman who jumped off the top of the Empire State Building. And as he was going past each floor, he said, well, so far, so good. If just before he'd hit the pavement had turned into a trampoline and he'd bounced to a halt, what kind of world would it be if every time something bad was about to happen, God popped in, made it all right, and then popped out again? You're in the kitchen, you're cutting a tomato, you're just about to cut your finger, the knife turns into jelly, or you take your knife away, take your hand away, and then the knife turns back into metal, and then you carry on cutting. We would have no understanding of cause and effect, we would have no understanding of science, the world would not make sense, and the price we pay for freedom is that bad things can happen to good people and bad people. And Annie Nightingale said, thank you very much, David. We'll play a few records now. That's the deeply meaningful conversation you get in Radio 1. The media get involved because, of course, they move from the world of description to evaluation. I hope you were listening to that moral reference that we had from Derek Burke this morning. There is a concern about the relationship between ought and is. And really David Hume is the man who first drew attention to this. You're describing how situation is, how things are, and then suddenly you discover they've smuggled in, so this is what you ought to do. And people have moved from an is, a description, to an ought, an evaluation. And the world of the media loves evaluation. They love it, and sometimes the more extreme the better. They love because they can caricature. They love because it allows them to set up that confrontational kind of model. They love to move from a description to an evaluation. And it's actually very, very hard to have a pure description where there is not some tinge of value, even in the way that you ask the question. I was lecturing the other week and saying that if someone says to me, have you stopped beating your wife yet? It assumes, one, that I have a wife, and two, that I am, or that I was, a wife beater. And once you've accepted the question, you already have embraced certain kinds of values. And sometimes we have to refuse the question. Not by saying I'm not going to answer that, but actually trying to explore that this is a flawed question, that they've slidden into the question certain kinds of evaluations. The media thrives on conflict. That's why they ask people like Derek, who disagrees with you. Sometimes they're too lazy to find out for themselves. So it's far easier if you can tell them. It's a little bit like a girls' school just outside Oxford. I was invited to speak. And they're kind of cheapskate, really. They said, we want you to come and talk about hunting. And what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to speak for half an hour on why hunting is moral. And then we'd like you to speak for half an hour on why hunting is immoral. And then you can take questions. Well, I said, well, why not get, two people so that we could have a debate? Oh no, you can do it all yourself. You can take both sides. I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or appalled, but it's a thriving on conflict. People like disagreement, because hopefully what the disagreement does is it focuses the points of difference. Now that's where good sharing makes the difference. Good sharing sets up what those differences actually are, and what the audience, what the listeners, the viewers need to be thinking about. It also, of course, thrives on personality. I was fortunate that some group paid for me to have a driver, and one of my drivers was a young man, and he loved the glamour side. He loved when we went to BBC TV Centre, being able to drive up and say, I'm David Cook's driver, and we're here for this program. He loved that. Well, of course, he also got to come with me when we went in. And I remember Jill Dando, who was a very attractive, striking woman. And we travelled up in the lift together. And I wasn't quite sure that males salivated, but certainly watching my driver researcher, he was salivating big time. And I think for the next year, he told everybody about meeting Jill Dando, because she was a personality. Now, what's her great skill? Her great skill was that she reads an autocue, and she can read it out loud, and she's photogenic. And newscasters, and Michael Burke is a good friend, but Michael Burke can read an autocue. What kind of skill is that? But they are personalities. There's so much personalities that I've been sitting in a railway station with Michael, and people would come and say, "Can I have your autograph?" And he would say, when you learn to say please, then you can have your autograph. But they talked to him as if they knew him. Everybody thought he was their friend, because every day he got into their home and they gathered round and looked at him and listened to him and had some kind of conversation, maybe one-way conversation with him. It's personality driven, and the media love personalities. They love Robert Winston. They love people who are slightly colourful, slightly over the top. They love personalities. They also love human stories. When we're making series about conflicts between professionals, or made a series about medical ethics, a series of series about medical ethics, always they were looking for a human story. My various producers would always say, find us a good case. The model maze was tried on television, and they did a pilot program on abortion. And they phoned me up and said, "David, can you find a woman who's had an abortion who regrets it?" And I said, well, it's not easy to find somebody to talk about what would be a fairly traumatic event in their life, especially if she regretted it. Oh, well, could you try? Well, I found a woman who was willing to talk about her abortion and how she bitterly regretted it. So the producer came down with his PA, and they interviewed the lady. And they phoned me up and they said, "David, can you find a good-looking woman who had an abortion and regretted it?" Now that told you a great deal about the difference between the world of TV. I have a radio face. It works well on radio, but when you put it in television, it's a different kind of thing. You need a human story. They need human faces. They need something, particularly if it's tear-jerking. They also, I think it is a strength for the media that they have a sense of immediacy. One day the hospital phoned me up and said, "We have a very unusual case. This is a woman in her early 60s. She's visiting from Southampton, and she had a stroke. And that was about 3 weeks ago, and since then she's had a series of strokes. But we think, actually, she's locked in." Now, locked-in syndrome is a very rare situation. It's where you are totally and absolutely aware of everything that's happening, but you cannot communicate. You can't speak, you can't move any part of your body, you can't blink once for yes, twice for no. If you could do any of these things, we could actually attach you to a computer and you could have a conversation. She couldn't do any of those. But from the CAT scan, it was clear that this woman was aware. And I went to visit the woman, I visited her family, visited with the doctor and the nursing staff and so on. And I thought, this is an absolutely incredible case. So I phoned up my contacts in the BBC, and they said, "Oh, it sounds wonderful, but we couldn't do anything." Now, I happen to know the head of television, So I phoned his office and said, we have here a unique case. There are probably only 3 a year in the whole of the UK. Within an hour, he had a camera crew in Oxford ready to film because there was a sense of immediacy. Now, you have to go pretty far up the ladder to get that kind of immediacy, but he can. And of course, you know, when Dunblane happens, when Lockerbie happens, immediately we're transported as if we're actually there on the stage experiencing it. There's an immediacy about the media, but there are also unexpected consequences. We made a program about conflicts between doctors and patients. And one of the patients was a woman who was HIV positive. She was HIV positive and she came to be interviewed with her doctor. Her doctor was there in the room while we did the interview. The young woman had decided she wanted to have a child. The doctor did not think it was a good idea for her to have a child because one of the effects of giving birth was it would turn the HIV into full-blown AIDS. That was the fear on the part of the doctor. So the doctor didn't think this was a good idea. The young woman said to me, the one thing I will not talk about on air is how I got HIV. And I said, well, I will try to remember that, but I may get carried away, and if I do, just say to me, I don't want to answer that question. That's fine. We went through the interview, and in the middle of the interview, she said, I want to have a baby. And I said, well, how far are you willing to go? She said, well, I have a partner. He doesn't know I'm HIV positive, and he uses a condom. And I've been making holes in those condoms, so that when he puts it off, actually, sperm is getting through, and I'll become pregnant. And I said, well, but your boyfriend might contract HIV and AIDS. Oh yes, but of course it's all right because he doesn't know. Well, he does know now if he's listening to the program, and people forget because they think they're just talking to you, but actually they're talking to a whole lot of people, and it's worse when it's live. One evening in the Moral Maze we were talking about euthanasia, and a man was very much in favour of euthanasia. And I said, well, you know, have you any experience of what that would be like? Oh yes, the doctor killed my father. And then he went as white as a sheet and passed out. Now on radio, this is a bad moment because you're having a conversation and suddenly you have a limp, unconscious man, so we all talked round it and they took him out and they brought him round. And afterwards I said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. He said, no, you didn't upset me. I realised that my mother, who was a great fan and heard I was going to be on the radio, was listening. And she didn't know that the doctor had helped the father die. And the way she found out was this young man telling the British nation that the doctor had killed. Now, it had implications for the doctor, who was then arrested, as well as implications for the mother and for the family. Because people don't realise that there can be unexpected consequences from broadcasting. I like the media, clearly, and the media has been good to me, but it does shape opinion. I remember in this program about euthanasia with the editor of the Times, then the editor, now a different one, and at the end of the evening he came to me and he said, I was very taken with this argument that you used, and you recounted the argument. He said, I think you'll see that the editorials will have a different line now on euthanasia. And that was amazing. You know, you think you're going to affect people, or you think you're going to reinforce views, but here was an editor who was actually listening to the whole program, listening to the arguments being offered, and changing his and the newspaper's perspective. It shapes both questions and opinion. But it also reflects audience responses. I thought John Gummer spoke really, really well, and I enjoyed his gentle, balanced presentation, you know, the style of everything. What surprised me was the absence of much reference to the other people in democracy, the voters, who actually are really fundamental in making the system work. Because every 4 or 5 years, then both parties have to answer to the voters. And if you're out of step with the voters, no matter how you've spun, no matter what policies you've had, if you're out of step, then you won't get elected. And that's a nightmare in any democratic kind of situation. Now, the voters affect, but so do viewers. The BBC has a system whereby every letter and every phone call that you do counts as the equivalent of 20 people. So already you have developed a power. So if there are 100 of you, that will count as 2,000. So you can actually make an enormous difference by writing in. Now, you have to write in separately. You can't write in the same letter. That's where the Animal Liberation Front gets it wrong. They have a pre-printed letter which they give people to send in. So you might get, 1,000 letters, but the 1,000 letters actually are all exactly the same. These tend to be discounted. But if you have, there's a requirement that these letters are shown, first of all, to the producer of the program, then to the controller of radio, if it's controller Radio 4 or Radio 1, whoever it happens to be, and he or she then has to see the response within 3 weeks to this thing detailed. And so you actually can make a difference. And if enough people actually took the time and the trouble, I know how often I've been sitting in the car or listening to radio thinking, oh, that's terrible, I should complain. But I never do. But if we don't complain, we get the programs we deserve. And we can make a difference. I thought in trying to look at bioethics in the media and public policy, I've talked about bioethics, I've talked about public policy, talked a little bit about the media. I want to take some examples to see the way in which the media have actually handled or tried to handle. And the first was Tony Bland. Tony Bland went to a football match at Hillsborough. He was a Liverpool supporter. The crowd lost control, and the police lost control of the crowd. There was, some people call it a riot. He was crushed to death. They laid him out in the grass. When the crash, the hospital teams arrived, they pleaded with him to get him going. They resuscitated him. The difficulty was he was in a persistent vegetative state. He was able to breathe himself. He could swallow himself. He could actually take in food. He had periods of sleep, periods of wakefulness, but he was totally and absolutely unaware of anything and everything that was happening. He had no consciousness, no awareness of anything. He was in a persistent vegetative state. Now, he was like that for 4.5 years. His father, Alan, visited him every day. His mother visited him to start with and then couldn't cope. The family had all kinds of struggles. So eventually the father said to the doctor, a man called Jim Howe, please let Tony die. And Jim Howe phoned up the coroner. He phoned up the coroner because everybody from Hillsborough, dead or alive, came under the protection of the coroner in case there were to be legal cases. And he said to the coroner, I'm going to stop feeding Tony Bland. He was being fed by a nasogastric tube. He could have been fed by a spoon, but they fed him with a tube because that meant they could put drugs in, and that kept him relatively stable. He said, I'm going to stop feeding him. And the coroner said, if you do that, I'll charge you with murder. Now, this didn't seem like a good idea to Jim Howe. So, what were they to do? Well, eventually, what happened was the House of Lords set up a working party looking at, they called it the Medical Ethics Working Party, but actually it was really looking at the Tony Bland case. And if you read the detail, you'll see the way that Bland case really comes through. It raised for the media, and we're talking now about print media as well as radio and television, tremendous problem of family impact. There was a family whose, their son went off to a football match, and they thought, Liverpool are going to win again, what's to work? And then suddenly they have pictures from Hillsborough rushing in, and they'll be wondering about their son and his well-being. And then suddenly they get word he's been taken into hospital, and he's moved from hospital over to Airedale, so they go to visit him, and here he is, and they have to be told that this young man is in a persistent vegetative state. Who knows what that is, and what's the prognosis and what that's going to be. And then for 4.5 years, their whole life revolves every day around Tony Bland. Other members of the family began to be affected. So the media pressure and the media intrusion meant there was a tremendous family impact. There was a legal impact. They changed the law. They changed the law because now feeding was no longer a basic human comfort. Feeding was now interpreted as a medical treatment, which meant that doctors could treat or not treat. Doctors could feed or not feed. And so feeding became a medical treatment. Now, the Royal College of Nurses still thinks that feeding is a basic comfort that should be given to every patient, but the law thinks otherwise. But the question they asked about Tony Bland was, would he want to be in a persistent vegetative state? How do you decide? How do you decide what a patient would want if the patient is unconscious? Well, of course, what you look for, and this I think is an oxymoron, a body of responsible medical opinion. But that means you get two doctors who agree with each other. But actually, what the House of Lords now ruled was not what does a body of respectable medical opinion think, but what would a prudent patient want if he or she were in that situation? Would you want to be in a persistent vegetative state? No, you wouldn't. And so Tony Bland wouldn't want to be like that. Therefore, we can remove his feeding. Therefore, we can let him die. There was a legal impact, which affected not just Tony Bland, but all PVS stations and children in neonatal units who now are not being treated. That is, they're not being fed, because feeding is a medical treatment. So the law was changed in very particular kinds of ways, which meant that when it came to treatment, there was a great deal of unease about how this would apply, not just to persistent vegetative state patients, but also how it would apply to other kinds of patients, particularly neonatal units, where a child might be born with some kind of handicap. Now, there was an interesting case which we've already had reference to, the Terry Schiavo case. Terry Schiavo was a young woman married. She had some kind of brain event, and she was taken to a hospital in Florida. She was in a brain-damaged state. Now, what was interesting about this case was there was disagreement about the diagnosis. Some people thought she was in a persistent vegetative state. Some people, and I spoke with a psychiatrist who was called in by Jeb Bush to examine the woman and to look at all the videos of her treatment in the time she'd been in hospital. And he concluded that she wasn't in PVS, but she was in what's called a minimally conscious state, which is a much less severe kind of case. So there was disagreement, dispute about the diagnosis. There was also dispute in relation to the family. She was married, the marriage had been up and down. Her family were very devout Roman Catholics, and as very devout Roman Catholics, they had decided that she would want to be kept alive, and therefore they wanted the doctors to keep her alive almost at all costs. The husband, who in the meantime had formed a new relationship, had a common law wife and had 2 children by the common law wife, decided that given the insurance money was going to run out fairly soon, that he would like her to be declared dead. And so he wanted her to be allowed to die. And so there was a family dispute. And we had on the one side the husband and his supporters, on the other side the parents and their supporters. The family was divided. It became a political dispute. It was raised in the Senate, where the Senate voted, in situations like this, we the Senate believe that we should err on the side of life rather than death. And patients like this should be kept alive, which was the federal position. But of course, states have different laws, and the state of Florida had a different law, and the law in the state of Florida was if you are married, your spouse decides what's going to happen to you. And the spouse was quite clear what would happen, therefore there was no contest here as far as the politics were concerned. But they actually passed a law, Terry Schiavo law, through the federal system. And there were various attempts to introduce a law in Florida, but that didn't work. It was also very clearly played out in the media. There was a societal dispute, a religious dispute, and a secular dispute. Here was society totally divided. There were mostly religious people who thought human life is special, and we have to be careful about ending human life. There were secular people who said, who wants to live in that kind of situation? There were others who said, look, husbands ought not to be making decisions, and families ought not to be involved. It's up to the individual. Now, if she'd had a living will, then that would have been fine, but there was no living will. So the husband said, the one time we talked about it, she said, don't keep me alive. The parent said, when we talked about it, she said, keep me alive no matter what. So who do you believe? And so there was a tremendous dispute in society. And then, of course, Alderhay. Alderhay, where a pathologist and his colleagues took samples from children who died without consent and used them not for fun, used them in order to discover what had been wrong with these children, what there's the pathology of the disease. The parents and families were very much affected, and the government called together meetings of religious organizations asking how we could stop the multi-funerals. People had had funeral when their child had died, and now they wanted a funeral for slide 1 and slide 2 and slide 3 and sample 4 and sample 5. And there were some people who had 6 or 7 extra funerals for the same child, or the bits of the child which had actually been a slide used for teaching purposes or research purposes. Parents and families were affected. The government intervened. But the impact that was not so obvious was the impact on pathology. The impact on pathologists, particularly pediatric pathologists, whose jobs almost disappeared. Their research almost dried up. But not only that, the kinds of diseases that they were trying to follow and seek adequate treatments for now were no longer having the kind of scientific research input which is necessary if you're going, 1, to understand and identify the disease and the causal sequences, and 2, to provide the treatment. Longer term, it's led to new transplant regulations. It's interesting to see now the way in which transplantation is being framed to protect the will of the patient rather than colleagues. It's been a long time the case that if you have filled in an organ donation card and you went into hospital and you are unconscious and you're technically dead, the clinic will say to the family, your loved one has filled in a form, we would like you to give us permission to take the organs. And if the family said no way, it didn't happen, even though the patient himself or herself had actually filled in a form. That will now become illegal. The patient's will, the patient's wishes, the patient's advance directive is going to be binding regardless of what the family say. And that's one spin-off from the Alderhay effect, trying to protect the will of the individual and to make sure that families are limited in what they can claim, though they will have a role in relation to children. What lessons then for science, media and public policy? I think there's a nexus, an interaction between scientific research, scientific practice and public opinion. And somehow science, scientists, various scientific disciplines need to grasp the nettle of public opinion. I don't think science is too complicated. I don't think that scientists are unable to communicate. I don't think that a public opinion is ultimately negative towards science. We all enjoy the benefits of science. We need science. And I think that we need to help develop proper public opinion. That's partly about education, but it's partly about training. We need to encourage the media. I was very pleased to hear that one of the things that the Faraday Institute does is they bring journalists for the summer. And they bring them specifically to talk about science and religion, so that they're exposed not only to each other, but they're exposed to quality people from all shades of opinion, how to develop a better understanding of science, a better understanding of the practice of science and the practice of religion, and the issues that where they intersect and perhaps even are seen to conflict. Media and public opinion. So it's not just about public opinion, it's about the media and learning how to use the media. But I think we do need to understand medical science today. I think people are really ignorant about what stem cell research actually involves, what it actually means. And again, I think this is a question of education. Many practicing scientists are ignorant about what stem cell research involves, what it actually means. I think we need realism. I think we need realism about what's happening today as well as what will happen tomorrow. I think we need to look very hard at the role of motives. Morality is affected, moral judgments are affected by motives. Here we have Rodney sitting in the front, and if suddenly I rush forward and slap his face, you'd all say, "Oh, what a horrid, nasty person that David Cook is." But I have to tell you, in Westminster College, Cambridge, there's a very rare beetle. It's a very rare beetle, which one bite from that beetle is absolutely fatal. And I saw, just as I was lecturing here, that beetle on Rodney's face. And not only did I see the beetle, its jaws were wide open. It was about to give Rodney a fatal bite. And because I'm a loving, gracious person, I rushed forward and I saved Rodney's life. I slapped his face, I killed the beetle, and I saved his life. And you all say, oh, what a wonderful guy David Cook is. Now what makes the difference? The action, hitting, is exactly the same action. His face still hurts. The beetle is still dead. The Animal Rights Liberation Front would be very cross, but I saved his life. That was my motive, that was my intention. And we now look and make a moral judgment about what happened in a very different way. Motives matter. So, do I want to be ennobled? Do I want to have my knighthood? Do I want to win my Nobel Prize? Do I want fame? Do I want fortune? Or do I actually want to help people? In the world of genetics, people think, there are mad geneticists out there who want to engineer everything. All the geneticists I've met, most of them started off with childhood diseases. They saw children whose parents were affected, whose parents were affected, whose parents were affected, and they did not like seeing children suffering. They thought, why? Why does this run in the family? And so they began to show an interest in the genetic makeup. And that's why so often the funding is hard, because there are very small numbers of people affected by particular genetic diseases. But they wanted to make a difference to people, to end human suffering, to bring about some kind of cure for people. We need to understand medical science not just in the role of motives, but in the involvement of personalities. Now, I don't really like personality cult, but I think that if we're going to work in the media, we have to recognize that whether you like it or not, you have a personality cult. We need to talk about the role of finance. Money is involved. We need money. Money is not a bad thing. But how we use our money, how we raise our money, how we abuse our money, how we fritter it away, the role of finance, the role of regulation. How can we help scientists, medical scientists, I'm thinking particularly of, regulate themselves? How can we help professional groups? I've been saying to the BMA for many years, if you do not tidy up your act, the government will tidy it up. And when the government sets its rules, they'll be much tougher than you would like. So show the public that you are people of integrity. Show them that you have high moral values. If you win public confidence, then the government will not interfere. If you don't, the government will interfere and they will make it tough. We need regulation. How is that done? By the individual, by the professional group, by the government? What sanctions are involved? We heard that if we followed the precautionary principle, we'd never do anything. And of course that's literally true. But that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be cautious, and that we shouldn't be cautious in advance. It means we do have to think very carefully, prospectively. What are the kinds of risks and dangers, as well as benefits, that will flow from a particular treatment, from a particular procedure, from a particular experiment? And I think that should be done in an interdisciplinary way. I do think that the growth of the world of medical humanities in medical training is really going to help. It's really going to help doctors who often have been brilliant medical scientists but hopeless people. And what we want are people who are, yes, brilliant medical scientists, but also are good at relating to people, because that's where much of the work of doctors is actually done. The medical humanities, I'm hoping, will help develop those kinds of skills. In the end, we come back to morality, and it should be no surprise that an ethicist is concerned about moral frameworks and about the extent to which there is a common morality. We heard a little bit about the yuck factor. I think the yuck factor actually speaks to something deep about human beings. That there are particular values, there are particular concerns, there are particular reactions, there are particular natural features which appall us all. To see somebody bruised and beaten, to see somebody raped and assaulted, to see a child being brutalized. These cause the yuck factor, not because we're emotional slobs, but because there's something deep and proper about human reaction to pain and suffering and distress and outrage. I think outrage is often a proper kind of reaction. Now, what we do with the outrage, we could talk about, but I think it's a proper kind of reaction. The slippery slope we've heard of. The slippery slope is very important. The danger is always that we will slide down the slippery slope. And so how do we then draw lines where people will not slide down the slippery slope? How far should we set limits? What kind of limits? And then how can we police those limits if we're going to prevent the slide to the extreme? just now in the US, much of the debate about genetics has taken a turn into the eugenics field. And we're finding many people talking and writing about the eugenics movement, which was deeply embraced and accepted by American society. American scientists loved it. And eugenics was really hot and strong in the previous century in American society. And people are having to think very hard about why did we embrace that? People think it was all a Nazi plot. Not at all. The land of the free and the home of the brave embraced a kind of form of eugenics. How can we avoid sliding down the slippery slope? How can we make sure that we're clear when we're offering a description and when we're offering an evaluation? And if we're going to say to people, you ought to do this or you ought not to do this, we have to recognize that ought implies can, means you are able to, and can not. You are able not to do it. There is a genuine choice that people have. I think that would point us back to looking again very seriously about some of the bases of natural law. That's not very popular in a society where we have so many artificial aids to everything, where our understanding of what is natural is not always easy. But I do think it's a winner. I think it's a winner in terms of the way that society loves things which are natural, and a winner in terms of the long history and tradition of the Roman Church in particular, which has viewed nature as not only being a source of goodness ultimately from God, of course, but actually good for people. It's interesting that it's not just inherent goodness, it's also instrumental goodness. It's actually not just goodness, it's good for people. There are benefits, there are advantages. I would like to have seen a more careful distinction between the sciences. My fear is that sometimes we fall into a trap which the logical positivists did. They loved the idea of unified science. And they thought unified science is going to solve all the problems of the world. And they talked about science as if it had a capital S and everybody should fall down and worship it. I'm not sure there's one big unified science. I think there are many sciences. And I think we need to recognize the diversity and the differences between the sciences. Yes, of course, there are commonalities. Yes, there are methodological and structural and process similarities. But there are some real differences as well. And I just want to plead to the Faraday Institute and to you folks, let's be appropriate in our difference. Let's celebrate what binds us together, whether it's morally or whether it's in terms of our view of science. Let's also be aware of difference. I start to stand up, speak up, and shut up. Thank you.
Sue, who wants to ask the first question? Holly,
A sort of question or comment about Alder Hey. 2 points, really. In a sense, do you think that the strong reaction was because the institution fell from grace, because it had a very high position in the local community? And the other point, did it come about because of the sensitivity to the emotional impact of asking for samples from children, or because there was a fear that the permission would not be given?
Thank you. This is a good question. I think if ever you want to raise money, children and dying is a great way of raising money, because people react very, very strongly to anything that involves children and anything that involves death with children. And so I think that part of the reaction at Alder Hey was that society doesn't cope well with children, doesn't cope well with children dying. And the idea that something happened to these children after they died was even more horrific. And so it took on a significance, I think, because of that particular thing. Alistair Cook, his letter from America, we know that body parts from him have been taken all over the world and used. And that's horrible. But there hasn't been the kind of reaction to that there was to Alder Hey. And I think that's because it's children dying. I think that we need to differentiate who in Alder Hey was doing what. I think there was a general culture in pathology. It was a accustomed practice not to ask for permission, because they thought it was too distressing. That was the way pathology operated at that time. But I think that there was an individual in Alder Hey who abused that particular thing for all kinds of reasons. So I don't think there was one motive that covered everybody in those situations. I think it was a little bit more diffuse and diverse. But I do think that what is hard for the public to understand was that, you know, once upon a time we never talked about sex in public. Once upon a time they would never ask a family for permission. They just assumed that the family would want to know how their child had died. And, you know, they wouldn't say, well, we're actually going to take a little sliver of brain, a little sliver of this part of their body in order to help you do that. They just wouldn't have done that. Now, of course, it's very different. But can we make that historical judgment where if we live now, we would ask a different kind of question, but living then, it was a different kind of world, different kind of professionalism, different kind of way of relating.
Ask a related question about the Northwick Park trial, which Pete referred to yesterday, and the cytokine shower that was provoked. And actually Dennis might have a comment too here because it's closer to your field than mine. I'm not clear whether it is normal to offer the drug to all the people in the trial at once or not. And there's been criticism of that, but I think I've come across trials where all the people were treated simultaneously.
Yes, the honest answer is it depends on the drug, and it depends what the protocol is. And that would have been discussed when they were given permission to proceed with the trial. Whether or not, if there was liable to be anything, say anaphylactic shock or something like that, they'd say, well, try it on 1 and then 2, so sequence it. But by and large, you're quite right. For most trials, it wouldn't make any difference at all, because you're envisaging such a small reaction, and therefore it wouldn't be that significant. The extreme reaction in this case seemed to indicate that it was highly risky. But you know, the researcher said we had no notion this was going to happen.
Yeah.
So the protocol might not have helped us.
Dennis, was it predictable? In hindsight, it's absolutely predictable.
In hindsight, I don't have any inside knowledge on this, but as to my understanding is that the protocols were carried out as they normally are for phase 1 trial, and they were carried out correctly. But in this particular kind of humanized antibodies against CD28, in fact, that they were using, where there might be potential for things of this kind, certainly in the future. You know, I think it's definitely going to be one at a time.
You bet.
So, the other thing I might mention is I was chatting with someone from a big pharma company a couple of months ago since this thing happened, and he was mentioning, and he's somebody who organizes phase 1 trials, he was saying that the number of people volunteering to do phase 1 trials have gone right up since this publicity, and it's a good example of how the media impact. And the reason is people hadn't realised you could get a couple of £1,000 or whatever doing phase 1 trial, and they had said correctly, I think, they had interpreted this happens very, very rarely, which is why it got so much publicity. Therefore, it will be worth a couple of £1,000 to go to the next phase. So impact of the media, I think, was quite strong in this case.
I have a friend who teaches bioethics, and a young lady came to him and said, I have been offered $10,000 if I will give my eggs for fertility purposes in the US. And he said, don't do it. And she says, why not? Oh, he says, because you can get $30,000 on the road to the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Who wants to answer next? Yeah. Yes.
I didn't really understand the reaction to the older hay business. And my wife and I came to the same view quite independently. We lost a son some years ago, and he had post-mortem, and we had not the slightest bit interested whether they kept any parts of him or not. And is it that we're normal? You know, where did it all come from? Was it whipped up by the press, or?
Well, to be honest, the government didn't really know, and they were looking to religious leaders from all the faiths to try to help them understand this, because they thought there must be some sort of religious significance. But there seemed no particular religious significance, except that there are particular rules in some faiths about how you handle a body after the person has died, regardless of what the age of the person is. But I think that the press picked it up because it was without consent. And they had this notion that this is the heart of medicine, it's consent. If there was no consent, it was improper, it was wrong, and so on. So that's why I think the press were interested. for families, I think some people cope better than others with the loss of a child. And some people will want to cling on. And the idea, you know, if you never discover if a child is taken, abducted, and you never find the child's body, that's extremely painful. And so I think that the idea that bits of my child are out there somewhere, you know, and I want him, her to be together, even though the child is long gone and just decomposed and all the rest of it, I think emotionally that was really hard for people. And they did become obsessive. They really did become obsessive. And it was tragic to read some of the letters sent to the hospitals pleading for, you know, this little bit of my baby. You know, and this little bit was a sliver, you know, on a slide, but that was significant to the family. And they wanted, the government decided, you know, loving, caring government, we would make sure this happens. And so research really came to a halt.
Was it related to faith at all? Because
I don't.
If somebody had a faith that child would live on, then, you know, whether there's a bit of sliver of liver here or there.
Well, all the religious leaders said no. They said this is not significant, and we are trying to encourage those who are dealing with bereaved families to call a halt and not to perform any more funerals. Because when it was getting to 7 or 8 funeral acts for the same child, this was just totally out of proportion. And all the religious leaders agreed with that. So there didn't seem to be a particular religious significance.
I also just wonder whether it's part of the pragmatic attitude that we scientists often have. You know, I mean, I think sometimes scientists are just used to, you know, handling biological material and get very used to that kind of thing. And I wonder if we don't get so used to that it's therefore difficult to identify with people. So I share your kind of feelings exactly. You know, that what does it matter? You know, that but in a sense, I guess in the general public, that kind of familiarity with handling biological specimens or whatever it might be is simply not there. Is it? So, and I wonder if that isn't.
And people don't see people dead. You know, they don't view the dead now. You know, once upon a time, culturally, that was very much part of our society. But now people don't do that. There aren't wakes. They don't sit with an open coffin. They don't visit in that kind of way. So culturally, we moved a long way. And death is a little bit frightening and distant from us.
Yes.
Ruth.
I think it's all going to be down partly to personal experience as well. I mean, I know parents who wouldn't let their child have a donor card. They said, no, we would find that too upsetting. And you might not find that surprising, but when you find out that they were medics, but they just, and it doesn't make sense at all, but that would be so traumatic, knowing everything that goes on inside surgery for us, with our imagination. And they just decided that was...
In a way they know too much, you think?
Yeah, they just, so I think it's hard to say knowledge helps you to understand these things, because it doesn't always help you to understand them.
Right, yes.
I mean, the other issue that's sort of bubbling in the background gently is the little cards that are taken at birth with the poor blood spot dots on. Because it's very dubious as to whether the consent that is given at that point actually covers the use that is now being made of them. And it's very unclear in the literature that you're given at the time that these are kept indefinitely. It's very, very unclear that they're linked through to other forms of research. And then at any time in your life, you might be contacted by a researcher who's investigating a particular disease and say, do you want to be part of that? So it might only be a little dot of blood, but there's a genetic research that's based on it. And right now, the custodians of it are extremely nervous that this could go pear-shaped and they have to throw the whole lot away. That there's no indication on the card at all that these can be used forensically, which they are now.
Yes.
Data Protection Act 1998 would not permit the storage of anything for longer than it has an identified purpose for, so they'd have to get rid of it if it's for data.
It's being held in a very strange manner at the moment.
Well, it's probably because it hasn't been considered as data, but if it were...
I mean, it's a sort of related thing, you didn't touch on, David, but we could sort of flag up in this context, is is forensic DNA and the whole thing of DNA storage and storage sequences, which sort of raises some of the related kind of things. Do you have any comment on that, Hilaire? We haven't sort of touched on that at all, have we? And it's quite a hot topic that comes back every now and again. So.
Yes, I mean, I've always found it hard to see why we would be fearful of having our DNA stored for forensic purposes. It's almost as if I'm frightened I might break the law one day, so I want to make sure that I'm protected against it in advance. I think it behoves groups like Liberty, groups who are libertarian in their stance, to show what the genuine danger is and whether or not the risk and the danger really are outweighed or not by the benefit. It's interesting to travel nowadays because of 9/11 and insecurity. And I was in Boston last week, the week before, and it's the easiest airport to get in and out of with anything. I had forgotten you're not supposed to take liquid, and I had a bottle of water, and I was getting on the plane and suddenly realised I had this bottle of water. I wasn't quite sure whether to produce it and cause panic on the plane or just leave it in the bag and hope that, because it had gone through security twice and nobody had picked it up. So I was highly reassured by that. But I'm amazed how much willingness in America, which is so individualistic and concerned about their own privacy and so on, they've accepted interference, they've accepted keeping information for the sake of security. So I think if the benefit is clearly seen, people will accept a great deal of limits.
They picked up my 5 highlighted pens that I was trying to take to the States the other day, so those got confiscated. You know, and I can't do without them because I spend my flight underlining papers, you see, so you need highlighted pens. Another question. Well, does anyone want to come back on the DNA question? I actually just wanted to come back to one point, which was about slippery slopes. And I think it's a difficult one. I mean, I think, let me take slightly the devil's advocate position, which is that actually we shouldn't worry about slippery slopes at all. That every moral issue has to be decided on its own merits, sort of one at a time. And therefore, the worry about the slippery slope is irrelevant, because actually we should just be deciding point by point as we go along. And if we worry too much about all the ways in which things go terribly wrong, we would be paralysed, we wouldn't do anything at all. I've expressed it more strongly than I believe, but just to see...
that's very proper. I think that my concern is how you think we make moral decisions, because you make it sound as if every time I come to a situation I say, I've got a blank sheet here, I'm going to approach this blank sheet and I'm going to ask how to make a moral judgment. Whereas in fact we bring a great deal of prior experience, people were talking about, family background, training, our own religious faith or our secular faith, whatever it happens to be. We bring all that experience as a way of framing the question, and we make the decision in light of our experience, which is why the slippery slope is important. It's important because it shows that cause and effect actually works, and that cause and effect can be beneficial, but it can also be very harmful. Therefore, I have to weigh the cost before I make a particular decision. I think the other reason I believe in the slippery slope is if you look at the abortion law, if you look at the Dutch experience in relation to euthanasia, which started off, well, it had to be 2 doctors, it had to be somebody who was terminally ill, and now people who are depressed, now children, are being killed against their will. And so I think there's examples of the slippery slope in legislation terms. But the real reason I believe in the slippery slope is because of driving in a built-up area. You know, you're driving around Cambridge and the signs all say 30 miles an hour, and of course, you know, everybody here today is very good, so you only drive at 28 or 29 miles an hour, because none of you would ever cross that line. I have to tell you, there are some people out there who drive at 31 or even 32 miles an hour in a built-up area, because the slippery slope argument is when I see a line, how far beyond the line can I go and still get away with it? And I think it's about human nature. I think the slippery slope argument at its root is not about cause and effect, it's about human nature and how we can protect human nature, how we can protect human beings, how we can protect ourselves from the kinds of excesses which I as a cheat am liable to have, or a community is liable to exercise.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I can support Dennis a bit on that from a regulatory point of view. We started Novel Foods, David, with absolutely no regulations at all, no practice, nothing. And it was the civil servants who said, go on case by case. And I was absolutely right. And if you think of slippery slope as handling on basis of precedent, we found that immensely useful. We did this before, now is this different? For instance, one that comes to mind is that we had approved a genetic modification in a rape cultivar. Then a very similar rape cultivar came up with the same genetic modification. Should you start from scratch all over again? And that's a sort of slippery slope article. And in fact, we made the decision based on how different the two cultivars were. But we use precedent a great deal. Now, in contrast, the commission that Phil worked on, which I had a little bit to do with, which was the Agricultural and Environmental Biotechnology Commission, tried to make broad statements about risk in particular areas. And Phil might want to say more, but it was top down rather than bottom up. And that didn't work, because actually there weren't any generalizations that could be usefully made. So I just want to make the point via you, Dennis, that precedent actually was the way we felt our way.
But I think there is a difference between feeling your way, and once you've felt your way enough, then you establish some general reactions, some general kinds of rules. So you don't say, well, we're going to carry on like this forever. We've had enough precedents now to know the kinds of things that follow.
Yes, no, exactly that. Yeah.
I think that the black hole we got into in that commission was the concept of unknown unknowns that one or two people were pushing. That we can never know about what we don't know about. And therefore there's this kind of black hole, this precipice lurking before us that we will fall down and not be aware of it.
So we shouldn't move.
And so we shouldn't move, that's the outcome of it. That you just stop all innovation.
Right, but the slippery slope is not about a black hole. The slippery slope is about known examples where things have gone wrong. And on the basis of things that have gone wrong, then you're cautious and you make sure that there is a legitimate difference here.
Well, it's also about things that go right, David. For instance, in the use of early embryos, you might say, well, we'll use the embryos that are going to be disposed of anyway, and then somebody says, well, there is a sort of intermediate case. I think what people worry that they're losing the hard and fast moral line that they've drawn around something, that we the regulators are blurring things.
And that says a great deal about whether in human nature we like to have black and white. We like to have set standards.
Yes, we do.
Because I know there's constant complaint from my students that I don't tell them the answer.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. I say they're not paying me enough.
Yeah.
So can we just bring in Ruth now?
Is it not a slippery slope? It depends on the circumstance. I mean, I think you're talking about a situation where you're in control and you can decide you can do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, and you're in control, whereas the euthanasia case in Holland is more, you're laying out principles for doctors who are making decisions at the coalface. So in a way, that's more like being a parent when you say, no, I'm not going to let you stay up 10 minutes later because it's going to be 20 minutes tomorrow.
Yes, okay. No, I accept that. That's helpful.
Well, the sort of, I think probably, Polly did, was this on the same topic?
Yes, I was just going to say that we do get numb, don't we? Those of us who can remember the Biafra or Ethiopian famine, and now we look at pictures of Darfur and I think I have to be honest that I'm not really moved because I just think, oh, it's that again. And in these situations, we get numb to the shock or the intensity of the situation and just think, oh, well, we'll just make a decision and move on.
Okay, well I think we're going to draw this to a close, and first of all just thank David again for his contributions during the session.